Hello everybody, happy Monday. This is going to be a video for notes on graphing rational functions. Make sure you have that note sheet in front of you as well as a pencil because I'll be doing some problems straight from there. So looking at our learning target, I can graph rational functions by finding all the important features and using a sign chart. So basically what we're doing today is we're putting everything that we have learned together. So we're looking for the intercepts, asymptotes, holes, as well as other special points that is going to help us graph this function that we might not know exactly what it looks like just from looking at the equation. So again, we want to start by finding all of these points. So if I look at my function, the first thing I need to do is I need to factor it. I look at the denominator and I need to factor that. That's going to look like x minus 1, x plus 1. But now my numerator, nothing to factor. That's just going to stay where it is. So now my first thing that I want to look for is the x and y intercepts. So first I'll find the x-intercept. Again, that's where you just set the numerator equal to 0. So I have 2x equals 0. I'm just going to get x equals 0 for that point. So that just means that 0, 0, my graph goes through the origin. So that's good because now we don't have to find the y-intercept because 0, 0 is the y-intercept. So I'm just going to go ahead and plot that point right away. Next, I want to look for the asymptotes. So we'll start with vertical. Again, vertical asymptotes are where the denominator is equal to 0. So x minus 1, if that equals 0, that's going to be a vertical asymptote, as well as x plus 1. If that equals 0, that's going to be an asymptote. So I'm going to get x equals 1 for that asymptote, as well as x equals negative 1. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to graph those asymptotes. Because this graph is kind of squishy, I'm going to count by halves here rather than by wholes. So my x-axis is going to go up by halves. And so my first asymptote, if that is negative 1, and then this is positive 1. So I'll just label that up here. Whoops. Still getting used to this writing here. This is negative 1. And then this is positive 1. All right, next I want to look for my horizontal or oblique asymptotes. So remember, that's when we look at the degree of the numerator and the degree of the denominator. Now here our numerator degree is less than the denominator degree. So that's when I know that I have a horizontal asymptote at y equals 0. So I'm also going to go ahead and graph my horizontal asymptote here at 0. So I know that that's where it is. Next, I want to look at any holes that we might have. If I look over here at our function, we didn't have anything that canceled out. So we don't have any holes with this one. We don't have any holes on this graph. So I'm just going to write none. Now I'm going to go down and look at my sign chart. I'm going to create my sign chart. Now we create these so that we can figure out what's going on over here, what's going on in between the asymptotes, what's going on as x goes to positive infinity. So we need to pick some important points that we're interested in. So our first point that I'm going to pick is I'm going to pick x equals negative 1 because now that's an asymptote. I know that the graph is going to get really, really close to this line. It's not going to cross it though. And so I need to figure out, is it above the horizontal asymptote or is it below the horizontal asymptote? The next important point that I'm going to pick is at 0 because now 0 is our y-intercept. So I need to know if this is going to look like a parabola, going to have that same end behavior, if it's going to look more like a cubic, have opposite end behavior. I need to figure out what's going on to the left and to the right of the y-axis. The last point I'm going to pick is at +1, because again, that's my other asymptote. I need to figure out, are we above the horizontal axis or are we below here? Oh, didn't want to color there. All right, so now I need to fill out my sign chart. So first off, we know that at -1 it's undefined. At 0, I'm looking at 0. And at 1, I am also undefined. So trying to fill this out now. So looking at the left of -1, to the left of -1. So maybe I'll pick a point like -2. So I'm going to plug -2 into my original function. So I have 2 times -2 all over -2 minus 1, -2 plus 1. So again, I just plugged in -2 for x. I picked a point to the left of -1 to try to figure out what's happening over here. I keep doing that. All right, so -2 times +2 in the numerator, that's going to be a negative number. And then if I look at -2 minus 1, that is also a negative number. -2 plus 1, that is also a negative number. So I have a bunch of negatives here. But now in my denominator, this is a negative times a negative. So this is really going to be a positive. Turns into plus, and then I have negative over a positive. That overall value is going to be a negative. So what that's telling me is that my graph is going to be under the the x-axis here, under my asymptote. So again, I'm not going to cross the horizontal asymptote. I'm not going to cross the vertical asymptote. I'm going to get really close. But I know that I'm negative because of picking that point of -2 and figuring out what's happening to the left of -1. So the next thing that I want to do is I need to pick a point between -1 and 0 and figure out where my graph is there. So maybe I'll pick a point like -1/2. That should be pretty easy. So 2 times -1/2, that's going to give me a negative number. -1/2 times, -1/2 minus 1, that's also a negative number. But then now -1/2 plus 1, that's going to give me a positive. So overall, this denominator is negative. Then I have a negative over a negative. That's actually going to give me a positive. So what that's telling me is that in between 0 and -1, my graph is going up into the positive direction. Now I need to pick a point between 0 and 1. So maybe I'll pick a point like +1/2. So 2 times +1/2, that's a positive. +1/2 minus 1 is a negative. +1/2 plus 1 is a positive. So this denominator now, the overall sign of the denominator is a negative. So positive over a negative, that value is going to be a negative. So now I know that between 0 and +1, I'm going in the negative direction. Again, I'm not going to cross that horizontal or vertical asymptote, but I'm going to get really close to it. And again, now notice that in the middle here, I crossed this horizontal asymptote, and that's okay. Horizontal asymptotes, for the most part, are just looking at the end behavior. So as long as my ends aren't crossing them, that's okay. Now I need to pick a point to the right of 1. I need to figure out what's going on to the right of this other asymptote here. So if I pick a point like 2, so 2 times 2 is a +4, so that's going to be a positive. 2 minus 1, that's going to be a positive. 2 plus 1 is also a positive. So that means that to the right of 1, I'm in the positive direction. Again, I'm not going to cross those asymptotes, but I know that I'm above the x-axis. So this is not a super exact drawing, but it's a pretty good one of what exactly this graph looks like. Now, for the sake of your homework, you can go ahead and graph this on your calculator or use Desmos and try to see if you did it correctly or not. But remember that you will not have that on the test. This is a no calculator test, but feel free to be checking it for your homework assignment. All right, so I want to go on to the next example here. This will be the last example that I do. Looking again for the same features that we looked at starting off that last example. So again, for starters, I want to factor the numerator and the denominator. So looking at this numerator, I'm going to have x minus 2 times x minus 3. That's how that's going to factor. And then I look at the denominator here. This is going to look like x minus 1 times x plus 3. I'm sorry, that should be x minus 3. So x minus 1 times x minus 3, because that's a positive 3. So I need a negative times a negative there. So now right off the bat, I notice that I have an x minus 3 in the numerator and in the denominator. So those are going to divide out. And again, when they divide out, that's when I have a whole. So I know that the x coordinate is at 3. X equals 3 is going to be where that whole is, but we need to find the whole coordinate for it. We need to find the y coordinate for it so we can plot that point. So if I plug in 3 for x, I have 3 minus 2 over 3 minus 1. So I have positive 1 over positive 2. So the coordinate of that whole then is 3, 1/2. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to plot that point. So I think I'm going to count by halves again. So I have 1, 2, 3, and then up to 1/2. So I have a whole. Now represent that by an open circle so that you know that a graph is undefined at that point, and we need to make sure that we're careful of that point, that we're not actually going through there. So the next thing I'm going to look at is the x and y intercepts. So starting off with the x-intercept, that's where our numerator is set equal to 0. So x minus 2 equals 0. I have x equals 2. And so my intercept there is at 2, 0. So I'm going to go ahead and plot that. So that's 1, 1.5, 2, 0 is where I have that point. And then looking at my y-intercept, that's just plugging in 0 for x. So y equals 0 minus 2 over 0 minus 1. So I get negative 2 over negative 1. Which is going to be a positive 2. So my y-intercept is at 0, 2. So 1, 2 if I'm counting by halves again. So now I have my intercepts. I know where those are. Now I'm going to look at my vertical asymptotes. We got rid of that x minus 3. It divided out with the numerator. So now I'm just concerned about that x minus 1. So x minus 1 equals 0. That's going to give me a vertical asymptote at x equals positive 1. So I'm going to go ahead and graph that. Positive 1 is my intercept, or is my asymptote there. Then next I'm going to look for my horizontal or maybe oblique asymptotes. Again, I'm looking at the degrees. The degree is the same. So this is really the coefficients of 1 and 1. So that's telling me that I have a horizontal asymptote at y equals 1. Again, when the degrees are the same, it's whatever those leading coefficients are. So I'm going to graph the horizontal asymptote at y equals 1. We already did the holes, so now we're ready for the sign chart. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my sign chart here. So my important points here now, I'm going to be looking to the left and right of 0, trying to figure out what's happening to the left and right of that y-intercept. I have an asymptote at 1. I'm undefined there. Intercepts at 2. I'm also concerned with where my x-intercept is. So I'm going to put in 2 for my x-intercept. I know that that value is 0. As well as the hole, I want to check to the left and the right of that hole. So my hole, that coordinate was at 3. So I actually have 4 points here now that I'm going to be picking in between to try to find what's going on with the graph in between those points. Well, if I look at 0 and I'm looking at my graph here, I know that this is the leftmost part. I can't be below this axis. I have to be in this little coordinate here. So I already know that this is going to be positive here. I'm going to be going up really close to that intercept, or towards that asymptote, and then I'm going to be going down really close, never crossing again that asymptote there. And again, in between 0 and 1, so in between 0 and 1 here, I also know that I'm going to be positive because, again, I can't cross that that asymptote there. And I can check by maybe picking 1/2. So I have 1/2 minus 2, that's going to be a negative number. 1/2 minus 1, that's also a negative number. So I know that I am going to be positive, again, by verifying with this sign chart. But now between 1 and 2, so between my asymptote and my x-intercept. So maybe this time I pick 1/2, so 3/2. 1/2 minus 2, well, that's going to be a positive number. I'm sorry, that's going to be a negative number. 1/2 minus 2 is a negative number. And then 1/2 minus 1, that's a positive number. However, overall, a negative over a positive, this is negative. So then I know that I'm going down really close to that asymptote, but never touching it. Now between 2 and 3, I look here and I have not very many options. I know that I only have that one intercept, and so I know that I have to go up, but then again not going through the hole. At the hole it's undefined, and then getting really close to that horizontal asymptote but not touching. So I already know that these are both going to be positive, that I'm not going to cross that horizontal asymptote, because again, horizontal asymptotes, we can cross it in the middle sometimes, but never with the end behavior. So again, these were two pretty representative examples of your note sheet. Your homework for tomorrow is just going to be finish that note sheet. So you just have those couple problems to do. Again, make sure that you're going through finding the intercepts, finding holes, asymptotes, as well as making the sign chart. So make sure that you're looking at all those different features. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. Remember that tomorrow is Pie Day if you plan on bringing pies. And also we are having a review day and your test is on Wednesday. See you guys tomorrow.